Welcome everybody. This is Jason Clockey. This is a presentation that I did at the Chicago RPM meet and also the St. Louis RPM meet, both in 2019. It's a PowerPoint presentation on my operations on my Chicago Great Western layout. First of all, I'd like to give a little dedication here to three men who helped me with the research on the operations on the area that I model on the Chicago Great Western, southern Minnesota, northeast Iowa, Rex Beach, Jack Mason Fuller, and James Reber. And as the slide says, without the kind and generous help of these three Great Western employees, the information for construction and operation of my model railroad would have been lost to time. And that's very true. These gentlemen were very kind in helping me prototypically operate the railroad by letting me know how the railroad operate, how it did all the jobs worked on it and things like that. They were very kind, generous with lists and time books and other materials, so a lot of credit needs to go to them. Here's a photo credit here for some of the photos there that I used throughout the presentation. First of all, I'd like to talk about the area of the Great Western that I model. This is a system map of the Great Western. You can see went to Omaha, Kansas City, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and there were some branch lines up in southeastern Minnesota, and that's kind of the focus of the area of my operations is the northern half of the Great Western. Specifically this area here, you see Rochester, Minnesota, Simpson, Minnesota, Ostrander, McIntyre, Iowa, Osage, Iowa, and Hayfield, Minnesota. And these are the towns that are represented on the layout. I picked these 6 towns basically because they were important on the railroad, but then also like Simpson, McIntyre, and Hayfield, they're all kind of junction points. They're you can see how there's another line coming off there at Simpson, and of course the main line from Minneapolis and St. Paul down the O line crossed the branch line that went up to Rochester at McIntyre. Hayfield, you can see it was located on the St. Paul O line main line, and you can also see the line going off to the bottom of the screen out of Hayfield. That was the line. Eventually went to Omaha, but went down through Mason City and ended up in CLARION. These are kind of funnels for traffic. Places, junction points, things like that added a lot more operation to the layout, and also served as places to pick up and set out and areas to feed that the mainline trains would feed the branch lines. Here's kind of a schematic of how things are in the basement, how I configured the layout. You can see Osage is in a separate room. That's the end of the line for that branch line that came out of McIntyre, Iowa, down to Osage, Iowa. The staging in that also in that room. And then in the big room you come up to McIntyre, which is kind of the focal point of the layout. It's kind of in an X-shaped. That's where the line, the main line out of staging, which would represent O-line Iowa, the main line would run through McIntyre, Iowa, up through Hayfield, Minnesota, and then back into staging, which would represent Minneapolis and St. Paul. So that would be the main line. And then at McIntyre also, you have the branch line that comes off and runs up to Rochester through Ostrander, Simpson, and then you can see Rochester there on the layout. The whole layout is based on these lists. These are prototype lists from the Great Western in O-line from May and July 1965. So it gave every train that came out of O-line going east to Chicago, north to Minneapolis, south to Kansas City, and west to Omaha, and then along with extra trains for the entire month of May and partial month of July. So I could really get a good feel of the traffic that was going up the line to McIntyre, Rochester, Hayfield, and also back down by studying the lists of the trains that were going to Kansas City, Omaha, Chicago, I could study the cars that came off of the branch that were going to those destinations also. So I had a good idea of the traffic patterns and things. These sheets are arranged from rear to front of the train. The train is blocked in 4 blocks, mostly from the head end. You have the McIntyre block, the Hayfield block, the Randolph block, and the Minneapolis and St. Paul block. So here's a typical Minneapolis and St. Paul block of train 42, which was the main line train that ran from Owine to St. Paul that would have fed the branch line there at McIntyre, and also the area up by Hayfield, which I model. And then the Randolph block would be next, coming up from the caboose. You'd have the Minneapolis-St. Paul block, and then you have the Randolph block. At Randolph, they set out a lot of cars there. There was a large interchange with the Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern Railway there. So there was often a large block of cars to be set out there for the M&N-S. And then the Hayfield block, which Hayfield is represented on the layout, and we'll see more about that later. And then the McIntyre block, which fed cars to the branch line that went from McIntyre up to Rochester and from Simpson over to Winona. Here's a timetable sheet, a scan out of a timetable from the area that I model. And the first train that we'll talk about is this train 92, and this is the first train in an operating session that runs. This train runs from Owine up to St. Paul, and with stops at McIntyre and Hayfield on the layout. 92 did most of the local work, setting out large blocks of cars at McIntyre and Hayfield. These setouts feed the various locals and branch line operations on the layout. You can see it goes from the bottom there. Owine sets out, picks up at McIntyre, and sets out and picks up at Hayfield. So we'll follow here train 92 on the layout and begin our operating session. So the train comes up out of Owine, first stop on the layout. Owine is represented by staging and stops at McIntyre. McIntyre was a very, very small town, still is to this day, 200, 300 max of population, but it had a small yard. You can see it's kind of configured in a Y. You can see the line down to Osage, to Owine, to the left there, St. Paul, and then you see the branch behind the depot that ran up to Rochester. Small yard, but a lot of activity in this yard. 4 mainline trains a day between Owine and St. Paul ran through here, and then you had the turn that came down on Rochester that came down every night and came down here, dropped its cars off for the mainline trains to pick up, and then picked up all the cars that were set out during the day for the branch, made his train up, went back up. So it was a very busy place for being such a small, isolated town in northeast Iowa. Here's McIntyre on the layout, a very simple track configuration, 3-yard tracks, a siding, and a Y. Here's another shot looking from the Y, looking north. As you can see, not a very big place, but a lot of activity went on there on a daily basis. Here's a prototype list here, a McIntyre block, and we'll just kind of go through. As we go through the presentation, I'll have primary source material here, lists and time books and things like that, and which were the basis for the operations on the layout, and which I found during my research when I was researching this area of the Great Western and setting up operations on the layout. So here's some 5111 is Rochester. So here's some typical Rochester cars. Salt for the cannery up in Rochester, and we'll get into what went on at Rochester when we start that part of the operations. We got some cars here for Rochester. You've got an empty reefer probably for the dairy up there, a potash car for Rochester Fertilizer, a load of pipe probably for Woodruff, which was a plumbing contracting company up there. So various loads in and out of Rochester. Rochester was the largest town on the branch, so definitely the majority of the cars going to Rochester would be on this list. And here we have some another example here, some WINONA cars here. Winona is important for the fact that at Simpson, just the first station south of Rochester, the line split off and they had trackage rights to Winona on the Chicago Northwestern. They actually did quite a bit of interchange with the Green Bay and Western there in Winona. And so you have a lot of cars that were come up out of O-line that were destined to the Green Bay and Western up in Winona. And so they would be set out at McIntyre for that branch line train to pick up. And then they would set them out at Simpson to be forwarded on to Winona. That's where the line split off the branch line and went towards Winona instead of going north into Rochester. And we have here another list that shows one lonely car that goes down south of, on the branch at Osage. Load of lumber, probably for interchange, possibly with Illinois Central there at Osage, Iowa. Here's on a typical Chicago Great Western main line train, 6 F units, 9,000 horsepower, and anywhere between 150 and 200 cars. That's the way they call them mortgage lifters. That's the way the Great Western ran their main line freights. You can see here he's at McIntyre setting out cars. He's setting out cars for the branch, and he will pick up any northbound cars that need to be forwarded on to Minneapolis and St. Paul. And now the next station he'll head to after this on the layout will be HAYFIELD, Minnesota. And here we see just another shot there setting out cars. So here's that car for Winona, and then you see in a car for Ostrander. There's that CP boxcar we saw on the list, which is a load of lumber for Rochester or for Osage. And then you see that load of pipe back there I was talking about earlier, in an earlier slide there for the Woodruff Plumbing and Heating there. And then the load of potash back there for Rochester. So I try to emulate the actual traffic patterns on the layout coming from information on those lists. Here's just another shot with him setting out the same block of cars. And then after we set out and pick up any cars that need to be forwarded on to the north, we'll leave here, and we're leaving heading northbound towards HAYFIELD and eventually on towards Minneapolis and St. Paul. So here we are at McIntyre again, and we'll leave and we'll go up to HAYFIELD, the next stop on the layout. And then from HAYFIELD, after we pick up and set out there, it's on north to Randolph and Minneapolis and St. Paul, which both Randolph and Minneapolis and St. Paul are represented by staging. So after the train leaves HAYFIELD, it goes into staging on the layout. Here's a typical HAYFIELD block. Austin was probably the majority of the cars. Austin cars were probably majority of the cars that were set out at HAYFIELD. There was a large, and still is, Hormel plant there. Hormel gets a lot of reefers, tanks, hide cars, trailers for the large meat packing operation there in HAYFIELD, or in Austin, Minnesota. And then there's some typical other traffic for the line that goes down from HAYFIELD to Austin. So you had several small towns there that would receive cars also. There was a large interchange with the Illinois Central at Lisle, Minnesota. So here's some cars for that local that would run south out of HAYFIELD. There's some lumber cars there. 3109 is Lisle, Minnesota, with the interchange with Illinois Central. And then you see some 3172. That would be a load of potash for Belmont, Iowa. There's another car there, 3139. Mason City was also a large customer there at Mason City that generated several large industries at Mason City that generated a lot of traffic that came in and out of HAYFIELD. Here's a prototypical shot of train 42 coming into, or train 92, excuse me, coming into HAYFIELD. And here's my representation of that same train on the layout. This is a picture taken on the layout of train 92 coming into HAYFIELD from the south. HAYFIELD had 2 yards. They had, to the left of this map, there was a larger yard to the south, but I was not able to include that large yard on the south. But you can see here the old yard, the yard that was uptown, consisted of about 5 or 6 tracks, and that's the part that I model on the layout, and it also lets me model some of the small industries there at HAYFIELD. HAYFIELD was aptly named. This is HAYFIELD on the layout at HAYFIELD. This is the south end of the yard, looking at the south throat of the small yard there at HAYFIELD. So here's that same train that was picking up and setting out at McIntyre. Now he's at HAYFIELD, and he'll reach into the yard and he'll set his cars out for Austin and Mason City and Belmont and other points that where the locals based out of HAYFIELD will take those and forward those cars down to those stations. But here's him picking up and setting out during an operating session at HAYFIELD. So after he left, he picked up, set out there. He left, and then they would go into staging, which represents Minneapolis and St. Paul. The next job that runs on the layout is a Winona local, and we'll go over that next job. It's basically just a job that comes out of Rochester, goes to Simpson, and then kind of disappears into staging. But anyway, this represents that traffic that we were talking about earlier that went to the Green Bay and Western in Winona. So Winona, you can see off to the top hand right there, is off by itself. That was reached via trackage rights from basically just a few miles north and east of Simpson. They got on the Chicago Northwestern and then took the C&W tracks all the way into their own yard there at Winona. So Winona turn would come out of Rochester, pick up the cars that had been set out for Winona and that line at Simpson, and they would pick them up and forward them onto Winona. They would yard their train. They would pick up any outbound loads, things, transfers off to either the CB&Q, Milwaukee, Northwestern, or Green Bay and Western, and then they would come back the opposite direction, drop off that loading at Simpson, and then return to Rochester. That loading would sit at Simpson and wait until the next southbound local would come out of Rochester and then pick it up and forward it onto McIntyre, where it could be picked up then by either north or southbound mainline freights. So here's a Winona local on the layout. You can see he's in the yard at Rochester, and he's picking up some cars and getting some cars ready to head towards Simpson. Typical power on this job was a RS2. Sometimes they would run F units down towards Winona, but a lot of times it was a RS2. So he's departing Rochester, heading south towards Simpson, where he'll turn, pick up cars, and head towards Winona. Here's Simpson on the layout. I did not have an area. There's a Y there at Simpson. I did not have the area to put the Y in at Simpson, but you can see how I kind of represented it with the two ends of the Y's kind of disappearing off into the backdrop on the left-hand side of the screen. So basically this train runs down there, turns around, comes back, and goes back up to Simpson, just basically staging cars that would represent the cars that came out of Winona. So here would be typically he'd be coming back from Winona. You can see the Green Bay Western cars back there. He's on his return trip back here on the layout from Winona, and he's going to cut his cars off. These cars are probably There's probably a carload of flour there from Bay State Milling, probably for Kansas City or Chicago. The Green Bay Western cars have paper in them for Des Moines, for Meredith Publishing, and there's some odds and ends box cars back there. Those cars will sit there, like I said earlier, until the next mainline freight out, or next branch line freight out of Rochester will pick them up at Simpson and then forward them down to McIntyre, where they can be picked up by the mainline freights. After he sets his cars out, he'll Y his power and pick up his caboose and turn around and head north back towards Rochester. And here he is at the north end. You can see the conductor walking up to line the switch, and he will be heading back north to Rochester to tie up. The next job that works is a Rochester yard job. Rochester was the largest city on the branch line in southeastern Minnesota there, and produced a lot of traffic for the Great Western. The Chicago Northwestern also went through Rochester, Minnesota, but actually the lion's share of the business was on the Chicago Great Western. So they had a daylight yard job there, usually worked 7 days a week. based out of Rochester to switch the various industries at Rochester. Rochester, like I said, had the lion's share of the business, but they had very Spartan facilities at Rochester. Here's a Walt Dunlap photo, and showing Rochester, you see the Mayo Clinic building in the background. Just a 3-stall roundhouse, about a 3 or 4 yard track, or 3 or 4 yard tracks, a couple spurs, and then an industrial area to the south of here. That's all basically what Rochester consisted of on the Great Western. But like I said, they had the majority of the business there in Rochester. So here's a picture looking at that 3-stall roundhouse, kind of looking towards the north. And then here's how I represented it on the layout. So this is the same picture, but taken on the layout. There's kind of a schematic of what the yard and the roundhouse area and stuff looked like at Rochester. Here's another prototypical shot, a Walt Dunlap shot, looking north towards the north there and looking at the roundhouse. And then we'll fade into a shot here on the layout. Here's just a kind of a shot here of the engine facilities. Like I said, very Spartan engine facilities, just a fuel rack and a sand house, and that one a turntable, and that was about it for the engine service facilities besides the roundhouse at Rochester. Here's a kind of a overhead or a north shot again here at Rochester on the layout. Just a small, very, very small yard. You can see the local from Rochester has pulled into the yard there and had his caboose. We'll go back to that slide there. And had tied up there. Here's the Rochester yard job switching there at Rochester. He's getting his industry cars lined up. You can see that CN boxcar. There's a lumber yard there. That was Hayes Lucas Lumber. There was a large cannery there at Libby's Cannery at Rochester. Canned vegetables, peas, carrots, sweet corn. You can see a boxcar spotted there over at Libby's, but he's getting the industry car switched out, ready to go start working the industries to the south of the yard there. Most of Rochester's major industries were located on the Great Western, like I said before. Libby McNeil and Libby, which is the cannery, which is the famous Iroquois water tower. If anybody's familiar with Rochester, I'm sure you've seen that coming into town on Highway 63. Rochester Dairy, which is AMPI now, that was a large customer. Woodruff Company, which was a plumbing contractor. There was a scrap yard there, Bemmel Iron and Metal, Rochester Fertilizer, Rodis Feed Mill. IBM was to the north, which is not modeled on the layout. Oil City was an area south of the yard that had a switchback configuration, which I model on the layout. It's not included in this presentation because it's an unfinished portion of the layout, but had a neat switchback configuration, and there was about 6 or 7 oil dealers, and the scrap yard was down there, and so that was called Oil City. And then there were several lumber yards located on the Great Western throughout town. Here's typical road power or typical power for the switch engine at Rochester. He's there at Libby's. This is on the layout here. He's pulling most likely a loaded DF car full of canned vegetables out of Libby's. Here's another shot of a car spotted at Libby's for loading on the layout. Here's that Woodruff Company that got the carload of pipe that we saw on the list earlier. This was a commercial plumbing and heating contractor. They did a lot of fabricating and things like that. The next train then, after all the yard work is done, the yard job will build the local. And so he'll build the local for the local that ran down from Rochester to McIntyre and then turns and comes back up to Rochester. That was train 125, 126. You can see there, this is a prototype photo of Walt Dunlap's. You can see the Iroquois water tower in the background. That's the Libby's complex. And yes, I do have the Iroquois water tower. I did model that on the layout, so that's also included, because if you're going to model Rochester, Minnesota, you have to have the Iroquois water tower. Here's a timetable scan from from the time that I model, showing train 125, 126, the Rochester McIntyre turn. The job ran as a turn out of Rochester every evening. It worked stations to the south of McIntyre, connected with the southbound mainline manifest freight at McIntyre. The manifest would pick up the local's train and forward it south to O-line. The local would then build its return train at McIntyre and work stations back north up to Rochester. So basically, this train did all the local work, took all this loading out of Rochester, did the local work down. It would set its train out at McIntyre, and then it would duck in the yard. Then a southbound mainline freight, which was due about the same time, would stop and pick up those cars and forward them on south to O-line. And that happened every night. That meet was made every night so that that traffic could be expedited south to O-line. And here you can see in the timetable, he's going south, and the stations we stop at on the layout are highlighted in red. So you'll see Rochester, Simpson, Ostrander, McIntyre, and then you head back up north after your work is done at McIntyre, and then head back north, working the stations going back north. Typical power for the local was 2 F units. During the mining season, an ABBA or ABBA set were used to handle the increased tonnage and iron ore extras. We haven't talked about that yet, but at Ostrander, Minnesota, there was iron ore loading. There was a wash plant there. Southeastern Minnesota at this time that I model, starting in the 40s, they were excavating large quantities of high-grade iron ore out of the cornfields there around McIntyre, or around Ostrander, Minnesota, and Fillmore County, Minnesota, that area, Spring Valley. And these deposits were just a few feet underneath the surface, maybe 6 to 7 feet, as shallow as maybe 3 to 4 feet under the topsoil. And so Hannah Mining came in and bought the mineral rights from the farmers, paid them so many cents a ton for ore that they extracted out of their land, and then they would remove the topsoil with scrapers, and bulldozers come in, take the ore out, take it to a washing plant, and they would load it onto the Great Western in 3-bay coal hoppers, and the Great Western would then take that down to either Dubuque or South Freeport, Illinois, and interchange it with the Illinois Central or the CB&Q, and they would forward, those two roads would forward it on down to St. Louis area, where it was used at a steel mill down in the St. Louis area. So this was going on at the time that I model, and it was actually a large traffic maker for the Great Western in this time period that I model. Typically when they didn't run ore extras, typically the train would pick up anywhere between 30, 40, maybe upwards of 50 cars of ore a night out of that wash plant at McIntyre. So it kept the main line, or the branch line, pretty busy, and a lot of tonnage came out of Osage, or out of Ostrander, Minnesota. Here's the Rochester local. So here we are on the layout. We're all pumped up with air, doing the air test, and we will start departing south, and our first stop will be at Simpson, Minnesota. Just a little kind of talk here. This was kind of an unknown area of operation on the Great Western. I say that because nobody really researched all that much about this part of the Great Western, and it was interesting because you don't think of iron ore operations, you think of the Mesabi Range in northern Minnesota. You don't think of southeastern Minnesota, northeastern Iowa as iron ore, but it was, and it went on until 1968. But Jack Fuller, one of the gentlemen who worked for the Great Western as a conductor out of Rochester, Minnesota, lent me his logbook, conductor's logbook. And so here we'll kind of go through kind of how important these primary source materials are for if you want to prototypically operate your railroad based on a certain time period, or or things like that. So here's a scan of one of his logbooks, and we'll go over. And this is the local out of Rochester that he's working on this night, and the date here, and we'll go through it and we'll kind of decipher it. So it's train 125, 126. You can see we have 3 motors. They're all F units, 106C, 115B, and 115C. And we'll kind of go through this here. And for people who are not railroaders like myself, I work for the railroad, but this kind of looks just like a bunch of numbers and gibberish, but I'll kind of go through it, and we'll kind of go through what a typical night on this job looked like. So 5111 is Rochester. So you see these numbers over here on the actual book. You see 530 to 550, 9-5, and then 595. Well, what that's telling you is he departed Rochester after 20 minutes with 9 loads, 4 empties, and caboose 611. 5118 is the next station and was there from 6:15 to 6:25. So he spent 10 minutes at Simpson, Minnesota, picking up 8 loads and 18 empties. Next station is Stewartville, Minnesota. Spent 10 minutes setting out 1 load at Stewartville. He left Stewartville with 16 loads and 24 empties and just a little over 1,500 tons. He spent 1 hour and 35 minutes at Ostrander shoving to the mine, picking up 45 loads and 1 empty. So 5130, if you look across, these all line up with the station that we're talking about here. But so that wash plant was on a spur that was 3 miles from the main line. So they had to shove back there, do their switching back at the mine, and then bring them cars back out to the main line. So that's why it took longer to do the work at Ostrander. 5115 is McIntyre. So he spent 3 hours and 5 minutes at McIntyre to meet 41, which is the southbound mainline freight that will pick up his loading, and switch his train out to head back north. When he did head back north, he departed with 21 loads, 35 empties, and caboose 611. Back up this next stop then was at Ostrander again, spotting 21 empties to the mine and picking up 1 load. Spent an hour and 5 minutes there at Ostrander again. 50 minutes at Stewartville, spotting 3 loads and setting out 2 empties. And then at 5118, we're back at Simpson. And it looks like there he set out 17 loads, 2 empties, and those are most likely for the Winona branch there. And then he arrived at Rochester with 8 loads, 7 empties, and caboose 611. And on the bottom there, you can see in his handwriting, 14 hours and 25 minutes on duty. So that was a typical day on that job. A pretty busy day. They usually work pretty long days, especially in the summer, like I said, when the iron ore was moving. So we'll follow this job. Like we said, we're ready to go out of Rochester. So we'll first stop, we're going to head south towards Simpson on the branch. Here again is Simpson, so you kind of remember the Y situation there at Simpson with a line going off to Winona up to the top left there. Simpson, Minnesota was a very small town. Here it is on the layout. It was pretty much encapsulated by the Y. The tracks surrounded it on all sides, but here it is on the layout. And here we see that the train has come in, and he is picking up those cars that came out of Winona. Remember that carload of flour that we saw earlier in the slide? Here he is tying on to that car and others, and he'll double back to his train there in the foreground and head south to the next station on the layout, which is Ostrander, Minnesota. Here he is departing south from Simpson and heading now towards Ostrander. So from Simpson, we'll head down to Ostrander. Here you can see a conductor there on the layout. He's picking up at the mine. He's checking his list there, the bottom left photo there. The mine was, like I said, was 3 miles from the main line, and it was a Y situation, and I represented that by a blind there where you shove back behind that kind of scenery break in that blind, and that represents the cars back in the mine. So there he is picking up his cars, checking the list at the mine. You can see the other top photograph there. He's going by the train order board at Simpson while he's pulling out the cars there from the Y. And so the first stop or first work at Ostrander is usually picking up the loads out of the spur on the mine there. These are some prototype shots, some David Meppen shots. These are from the John Lukey collection, these black and whites. These were taken in, I believe, 1967, but here is that local, and if you can see back behind the first car, behind the two F units, you see maybe it might be a boxcar or a covered hopper, and then you see all them long lines, a long line of, looks like 3-bay or maybe 2-bay open top hoppers. Those are cars that he pulled out of the mine. He's heading into Ostrander. They're going by the depot there. You can see a couple cars over by the elevator, but this is that same local, a prototypical shot, and then now we'll fade into the shot on the layout of the same kind of scenario. Here's a shot kind of giving you an overhead view of kind of the layout there at Ostrander. They had set down a motor car there to use as a depot. You can see the elevators in the background, and then back there on the siding you can see some string of empty 3-bay hoppers for the mine that were set out on the siding there. And then after the work's done there at Ostrander, after doing any picking up there at the mine, we'll head south then towards McIntyre. Here's McIntyre again, just to orientate you. Off to the top left there, you see the Rochester main. That's the branch line coming down from Rochester and how it ties into the main line. Then you have the siding, tank track, Osage main, house track, the Y track. Very simple track layout, but there'll be a lot of activity here during an operating session, and prototypically there was a lot of activity here. So what the branch line train will do from Rochester, if you follow the yellow arrow when we come in here, he'll come down here and he'll cut his train off. He'll take any cars that he has for McIntyre and he'll run down the main. He'll back into the siding. You can follow the yellow animation there, and then he'll sit in the siding, run around his train on the siding or through a yard track, and then he'll do any switching because, you know, there'd be cars probably on these other 3 tracks, the tank track, Osage main, or house track. There'd be cars there for him to switch out to build his train to head back north. Those cars will sit on the Rochester main, and that's where the mainline train will come in and pick up that loading and forward that on down to the south to the main yard at Oline, Iowa, which is represented by staging. Here's a prototypical shot, another David Meppen shot. This is the local. He has cut his train off probably to the left of the depot out of the frame of this picture, but you can see the 2 F units, and what he's doing is he's shoved his cars, any cars that he needs to either take back north or leave at McIntyre, he shoved them into the siding, and he's running up the main to get on the other end of the yard so he can do his switching from the north end of the yard and leave the main clear. So that will leave the main clear for the southbound manifest train that will be there arriving shortly. Here's the same situation, but this is a picture on the layout. And here's another shot. You can see he's come back around. If you look behind the F units, the caboose is there. That's the train that he shoved into the siding and he ran around, and now he'll start making some moves on that. You can see cars in the yard there. Those are cars for him to head back up north towards Rochester with. So he'll begin his switching there while he's waiting for the mainline freight. And then here it is represented on the layout. And then here's another shot. You can see he started to make some moves on those cars in the yard, most likely getting his train lined up to head back north. Here's a similar shot from the layout. Another prototype shot. Here's one on the layout. So while this is all going on, this mainline train will come and pick up those cars. So if you look off to the left hand of the screen, there'll be some animation coming in there, and that'll be the mainline train coming down from St. Paul heading south to Oline, and he'll come in here off to the left. He'll cut his train off back into those cars on the Rochester main that the branch line train set out, pull ahead, double back to his train, and then he'll head south to Oline, where those cars will be forwarded on to points like Kansas City and Chicago and Omaha. And then the branch line train will continue to do his switching, and then eventually pull out to the main, shove down the main, and then head back north up the Rochester main towards Rochester and work his way back towards Rochester. Here you can see that meet taking place. I was telling you about the mainline train coming down from St. Paul. You can see the 6 F units, 9,000 horsepower, and a long string of cars back there. And you can see the 2 F units of the local sitting there waiting for him to clear so they can get on the main and finish their work. This is another David Meppen photograph. Here it's the same kind of situation, but on the layout. Here's after he has picked up those cars. I don't have any pictures of him actually making the pickup, but this is after he's picked up and he's heading south now, heading towards Oline. And then here's the same kind of shot on the layout. And then after the mainline train clears, he'll come out and shove down the main, and then he'll head north, throw the switch behind the depot there, and head north towards McIntyre, or towards Rochester, Minnesota. So here's another prototype photo of the local with his train all together, shoved back, and now heading north through the switch and heading north towards Rochester again. And then here's what it looks like on the layout. And then he got the caboose going by the depot, a prototype shot of the same train with a caboose trailing by the depot, heading north back towards Rochester. And here's the same kind of shot on the layout. Now we'll talk about that train that picked up there at those cars off the branch at McIntyre. That was train 41, which is the St. Paul Oline Manifest. Train 41 works south from St. Paul with setouts and pickups at Hayfield and McIntyre. The cars from the branch line locals are picked up and forwarded onto Oline, the main classification yard on the CGW, which is represented by staging on the layout. So you can see you head south, working Hayfield and McIntyre on the layout. So here's kind of a map of the area. South out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. First stop on the layout is Hayfield. Here he is picking up at Hayfield. This is the south end of the Hayfield on the layout looking north. You can see back there some reefers and some trailers. Those are loaded from the Hormel plant at Austin. He's picking them up to forward them on to Chicago. Here he is, same thing, like I explained in the earlier slide. This is on the layout, him picking up at Hayfield. After he picks up at Hayfield, he'll head down to McIntyre and make that move that we just talked about at McIntyre. And we saw the prototype photos of that move earlier in a couple slides earlier, and here it is on the layout happening. My operator's there making the cut. You can see behind the gentleman in the green shirt there, you can see the local has left his cars on the branch line there up to Rochester. He left the cars for that train sitting on the branch, and then those 6 F units will pull down and pick up those cars and double back to the train and head out. You can see there the 2 F units waiting in the clear on the siding for that move to take place before they double their train and head back up the branch. Here's another shot, kind of looking north. The local there on the siding and the main line 6 F units heading down to clear the switch and back on and pick up the cars and head south. The next job that this one runs out of Hayfield, is the Austin Turn. And the reason for the Austin Turn, there were 2 of them a day. I only usually do one an operating session, but was to service the large Hormel plant at Austin. The Spam is a very famous Hormel delicacy, but that's where Spam's made, and a lot of traffic in and out of Austin due to the large plant there at Austin, the Hormel plant. So they ran, like I said, 2 turns down a day. Primary job was Hormel in Austin. They also did some local work in Austin, and you can see that prototype. These 2 prototype photos. The top is the Hormel plant at Austin, and then bottom is one of the Hormel turns, or one of the Austin turns, I should say. And the typical power on that was also an RS2. They made connections they would take the meat to make connections with the mainline freight, and the mainline freight would then forward that on to Chicago. Usually they made a connection with the Indiana Harbor Belt at Bellwood, Illinois, but that's why they ran 2 turns, because they would set up a morning shift and an afternoon shift at Hormel, and then all that meat traffic would come back, and they would expedite it then south towards Oline, and then eventually east towards Bellwood, Illinois. I don't model that part of the layout as far as down to Austin. So basically, these trains run in and out of staging, but they come back into Hayfield, and that allows the operators at Hayfield some more work, and then also gives more traffic to feed on and off the mainline freights. But here's Hayfield, and you see they'll go down to Austin, and then come back after a few hours of switching and head back north with loads of meat, and they'll be staged at Hayfield for pickup. Here's just kind of an aerial view of the large. You can see how large the packing plant is. There's you can kind of make it out there in the foreground of the picture, but the Great Western kind of cuts across at the bottom of the photograph there. That's their tracks into the yard. The Milwaukee also got in here and got some of the traffic too, but of course we only model the stuff that the Great Western had. So here's a couple other Walt Dunlap photos of the plant at Hormel. You can see the RS2 there and some Hormel reefers in the background. Typical power, like I said earlier, this is a shot on the layout. Typical power for the Austin turns were the Alco RS2s. Here's a shot on the layout in Hayfield. You can see he looks like he's lining up some cars. He's got some tank car there and a couple reefers and maybe some few box cars, getting them lined up, ready to head south towards Hayfield south towards Austin on an Austin turn. Here's another prototype shot of a Austin turn at Hayfield. Another shot on the layout. Here he's working the yard at Hayfield. Here's a return shot of him coming back from Austin. And then here's kind of another similar shot on the layout of an Austin turn coming back from Austin, coming into Hayfield from the south. This is a comparison shot here of 2 movies that I did. The bottom right-hand screen is from a promotional film by Hormel done in 1964, where they tour the plant and facilities in Austin. You take a tour of all the processing and beef and pork processing plant there. And the upper screen there on the left is my shot on my layout of the same opening sequence of this film. The 2 boys in the bottom screen there write a letter to Hormel, and they ask to tour the plant. And they're running towards a field here off of their farmyard. And in this opening sequence of the movie, you hear a train horn, and lo and behold, if it isn't a northbound Austin turn, returning from Austin heading north towards Hayfield, and the boys watch the train go by and whatnot. But anyway, you don't see very many movies from the Great Western, let alone this part of the Great Western, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that in the opening scene of this promotional film. So we'll play both of these at once. The top left screen is the representation of the same kind of shot on the layout.
Introducing Brad and Greg, sons of Dale Rugg, a typical Minnesota farmer. Minnesota annually ships large quantities of meat and other agricultural products to consumers throughout the United States and in foreign countries.
Gee whiz, look at all them Hormel cars. Yeah, wonder what's in them and where they're going. Hey, I know what. Let's write a letter and ask if we can visit the plant. Dad'll take us, I bet.
The next job that runs out of Hayfield is this Clarion Hayfield local. This job ran from Clarion up to Hayfield and then turned and came back. They usually laid over at Hayfield. But it serviced a lot of important industry and generated quite a bit of traffic that went in and out of Hayfield. I don't model that branch that went southwest out of Hayfield that went through these towns like Austin, Mason City, Belmont, Clarion. But like I said, there was a lot of industry down there, and having this job coming in and out of staging into the yard at Hayfield gives the operators more trains to run, more things to switch, and then also gives more reason for the mainline freights to pick up and set out at Hayfield. This is a Walt Dunlap shot again of the Clarion Hayfield local. Typical power on this local was also just 2 F units. Like I said, it ran out of Clarion to Hayfield, returned the next day, serviced towns along what they call the Mason City district. Various large industries located on the district. Loading was taken to Hayfield to be blocked and picked up by manifest trains at Hayfield. So like I said, it gives more reason and more, I should say more reason, but more activities and more things for the crews at Hayfield to do. Here's a scan of the Mason City District timetable from the Great Western. Like we had talked earlier, all stations to Hayfield are represented by staging on the layout. The local runs from staging to Hayfield and return, which allows more operations at Hayfield. So here's kind of an overview of the map where it actually ran. So we're coming up north out of Clarion to Hayfield, and then they would lay over and return and work all those stations on the way down again. Like I said, there's a lot of large industry. This is Mason City, Iowa. This is where I'm originally from. And you can see the red there, that's the Great Western Tracks. And you can see on the top there, American Crystal Sugar Company, Lehigh Cement Company, and then in the front part of the photograph there is the large Northwestern States Portland Cement Company, all serviced by the Great Western, and other railroads got in there too, the M&L, the Northwestern, the Rock Island. But it did produce a lot of traffic for the Great Western. So this Clarion Hayfield local is an important job to be represented on the layout, at least running into Hayfield and stuff. Here's a prototype shot of a Clarion Hayfield local. You can see back there all the cement hoppers. Those are for Mason City, for the 2 large cement plants there that we discussed in the previous slide. Here's a couple Great Western cement hoppers at Hayfield looking to head back down towards Mason City. This is a shot on the layout. This is the American Crystal Sugar Plant, Great Western switcher switching there, a prototype shot. Also at Mason City was large American tile industry, and that was also served by the Great Western. It's highlighted, their tracks are highlighted in red there. So there was also brick coming out besides brick and tile and the cement from the cement plants, the sugar from the sugar beets. South of Mason City, Belmont, Iowa had a large soybean processing plant that generated a lot of traffic on that line. Here's a Central Soya car for that same plant there at Belmont. This is a shot on the layout. Also south of that line there at Fort Dodge, there was 4 large wallboard plants gypsum plants at Fort Dodge. And during the time that I modeled, there was a large building boom going on in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So a lot of this traffic, wallboard, cement, brick, tile, was going north towards Minneapolis, St. Paul, which means it would come up via Hayfield. So this traffic really, this train really produces a lot of traffic. They would have came through Hayfield, so that's why we model that just coming in and out of staging, because a lot of this traffic was heading north, and the four plants there were USG and National and Celotex and Bestwall, and here's a couple of modeled gypsum loads on bulkhead flats sitting in the yard on the layout at Hayfield. This is a prototype shot. We talked about Canadian lumber and for the Illinois Central at Lisle, Minnesota earlier, and here's a prototype shot of that same CLARION Hayfield local leaving Hayfield heading south, and that whole large block there is all Canadian and Northern lumber, either off the Sioux Line or the MN&S or the Great Northern or Northern Pacific there at Minneapolis, and heading south and for interchange at Lisle with the Illinois Central Railroad. Here's a couple on the layout there, a couple of loads of lumber for that interchange at Lisle, Minnesota with the IC. This is a couple, we got a D&H boxcar and a Canadian National boxcar. Here's a shot of the depot area uptown at Hayfield, a Walt Dunlap shot and prototype shot. He's got his train together. If you look at that first car, it's a D&H car, just like the one in the previous photo on the layout. That's more than likely, that's probably a car of lumber that's going to be dropped off at the interchange at Lisle, Minnesota for the Illinois Central. And then we'll fade into a similar shot on the layout. The last job that runs is an Osage turn. The Osage branch was a small, about a 16-mile branch, 17-mile branch that came off the yard there at McIntyre and headed south to Osage. And they would run down there usually about once a week. And the funny thing is that that train would only run down once a week, but there was actually quite a bit of customers located on the Great Western. The Great Western was serviced also at Osage by the Illinois Central, but there was quite a bit of customers on the Great Western at Osage, and I thought that kind of funny because they only came down once a week, and I thought that's horrible service. You know, the Illinois Central, the train went one each day through there, and I was able to get a hold of one of the last agents at Osage that worked for the Great Western. I asked him, I says, you know, hell, there was a couple of elevators and some oil dealers and feed dealers and stuff. I says, on the Great Western, I said, was there much traffic? He said, well, yeah. He said, there could be actually. He said, in the fall, you know, of course, the grain and things like that. But he said, I said, well, that's horrible service. Why did they even bother shipping? And he said they had an agreement made out with the customers that because the Great Western would only go down the branch, and you know it was light rail and 5 and 10 mile an hour track. He said they had an agreement made out with the Great Western that because they only came down once a week, they wouldn't charge demurrage for the cars all week long. So the customer would have all week long to either load or unload the cars at Osage before they would get charged. So they would actually, if the shipment wasn't needed to be expedited, it wasn't, you know, needed to go out the next day, they actually preferred, because then they would have all week to load or unload their cars. So they would actually prefer to ship on the Great Western in that respect anyway. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I asked him, I said, well, did you ever see did you talk to the guys when they come down and worked the branch? And he says, no. He said the train usually came down on Sundays, and Sundays was his day off at the depot. So here we're just kind of going what I just said, and usually ran light. It ran light from Rochester. This job came all the way down from Rochester, so it would pick up caboose at Rochester. Usually power was a Alco S1, and it would run light down to all the way down from Rochester to McIntyre, and at McIntyre it would pick up any cars that had been set out the whole week for Osage, pick up those cars, run them down to Osage, spend a few hours at Osage spotting, pulling cars, and come back up, and then they would drop their train at McIntyre to be picked up by another mainline freight later in the day, and then they usually ran back light caboose or caboose and engine all the way back to Rochester. Here's a typical day on that job here that Jack Fuller had out of his conductor's logbook. You see Osage Extra there, and 5111's at Rochester, so we left in the morning there about 9:20 in the morning, and they stopped at Simpson to register and put ice in the caboose, and looks like they stopped at Leroy, Minnesota to eat, and they've stopped down there to looks like 1:20 to 1:30 p.m. Looks like they picked up 2 loads and 1 empty at McIntyre, and then they headed south to Osage, and when they left Osage they had 7 empties and dropped them off at looks like they dropped those off at McIntyre, and then they headed back north, and looks like 14 hours and 45 minutes on duty, 212 miles of pay. So it was a long day when they had to go down to Osage too. Here's kind of an overview. So they came out of Rochester all the way down, just a caboose and an engine, pick up the cars at McIntyre, head down to Osage, do their work, head back up, drop the cars off, and then their caboose hop all the way back up to Rochester. So here's, you can see the Iroquois water tower. This is a a shot on the layout. So you can see the Iroquois water tower that I built. But here he is. This is him at Rochester, leaving to head south with his Alco S1 and a caboose. So he'll head down towards McIntyre from Rochester. Here he is at a prototype shot taken at McIntyre. Here he's apparently there was only 1 car to take to Osage, so here he is with the 1 car. They're probably the crew's probably off eating somewhere, maybe in the caboose or something, but here he is going to be heading down towards Osage. And here's a similar shot on the layout. Here's kind of the overview of what Osage looked like. The IC tracks are off to the right there, and then you've got these kind of balloon type tracks in Osage of the Great Western. You can see that a couple elevators there, a feed, a farm service, an LP, a ready mix, Osage feed and seed, a lumber shed. So there was quite a bit of customers on the line there for at Osage, and this was a stub end. This yard stub ended. If you see off to the top right there, Osage feed and seed, where those 2 tracks come together, it only went maybe another 10 cars or so before it stub ended. So a lot of times they would have to run in here and cut their train off and run around and do the switching from the north. You know, and there may be cars sitting on every track here, and one spotted at the ready mix, and one spotted at the freight house or the Felco feeds, and one on the Osage main in front of the Osage co-op elevator. So a lot of times they'd have cars on both ends of each other, or both ends of the engine doing their work here. But it makes for some interesting switching, prototypically and during an operating session. Here's kind of an overhead shot of Osage there on the layout. You can see the Illinois Central in the bottom of the shot here. There's a couple 3 cars on the interchange, the IC depot and freight house there. And then in the back you can see the large elevator and the feed mill and smaller elevator, and there's a ready mix in the back, and all customers on the Great Western at Osage. Here's kind of a ground level shot looking north on the layout. Here's kind of working from the other end, the north end of the yard at Osage. Here's a prototypical shot. It's kind of a similar shot on the layout. And then they do their switching, and here's another shot of another Osage turn on a different day heading back north. This is on the layout. This is heading north from Osage, heading back towards McIntyre, where he'll set these cars out and then most likely return back to Rochester with just the engine and the caboose. But this is a shot on the branch to Osage on the layout. Nearly all the trackage that we talked about and is modeled on my layout is gone or was abandoned by the 1980s. Less than 2 miles exist today. This is an excerpt out of if you want to know more about the Great Western, I recommend that you either get the Chicago Great Western by H. Roger Grant, that's a corporate history. That's a very, very good book, very good read. He's a very knowledgeable person when it comes to the Great Western, and he did a great job with the book. But this is a quote out of the book. This is a Jim Reber photograph here, and this is out of the book. And this is the official end of the Chicago Great Western was only hours away when James L. Reber, a dispatcher in O-line, photographed business car 100 leaving town on a Kansas City bound freight. President E.T. Reedy and his grandchildren were aboard the company's finest piece of rolling stock. So this was taken on the last day, the last evening of the Great Western. At midnight that night, the Great Western was gone and merged into the Chicago Northwestern. James Reber is a retired dispatcher for the Great Western, still around today. Super nice gentleman, helped me a lot with my research and information about the layout. He was one of the people that I dedicated this to, but I thought this was a fitting way to end the presentation, and that will be it. Any more information that you would like to know about the Great Western, I'd recommend, like I said, the Hastings book, or not the Hastings book. Philip Hastings did a Chicago Great Western pictorial book. You can still get that as a paperback. A lot of photographs of the Great Western from that book. The H. Roger Grant book is a great book, corporate history from beginning to end. That's also a good book. And then there's also John Lukey did a more Chicago Great Western in Minnesota, and that really highlights the area that I model and stuff. A lot of good photographs, and he's a very good narrative writer, and he did really well with that book. So any questions or anything like that, you know, those books probably answer most of anything that you would want to know about the Great Western. So thanks for watching.